My name is Lee Sustar. I write on labor for Socialist Worker. I've had the privilege of chasing around a lot of teachers, including those in this room, for the past few weeks for a book I'm working on about this. I think it's a story that every time I speak to someone, a rank and file activist, an organizer, an officer of the union, a parent activist, my appreciation of what was accomplished only deepens. Because what we saw here in Chicago was the reestablishment of social unionism on a scale and with an impact that hasn't been seen in decades. It's a strike that should be studied and learned from and generalized. And I think that's really the purpose of this meeting today, to try to talk about, hey, wasn't it great we beat Rahm, and kind of pound our fists and shout. I'm in favor of doing that, cheering over defeating Rahm Emanuel, who, as George Schmidt here likes to point out, was one of the key strategists of the neoliberal policies on an international scale, celebrating The Economist magazine, Time magazine, and so on. That's fantastic to kick his butt and celebrate that. But I think what we're going to do in this meeting is something more than that, which is to actually go through how the union was able to make this turn, and from the activism that took place many years before the current leadership came into office. We've got three speakers today. I'll introduce them more in detail in turn. They have Jesse Sharkey, Brandon Johnson, and Becca Bohr, who'll be speaking in that order for about 12 minutes apiece, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. This is an extended session, so that, I think I want to encourage a lot of questions to be asked, and arguments, disagreements that can come forward as we hash this out, and the panelists will have a chance to come back during the discussion and, of course, wrap up at the end. So, as I mentioned, the first speaker will be Jesse Sharkey, who is currently the vice president of the Chicago Teachers Union. Jesse's been a long-time labor activist. He was a product of the AFL-CIO Organizing Institute way back in 1992, and did the right thing by ignoring everything he learned there and embracing a very different kind of strategy of unionization. He was able to do a lot of work with the steelworkers, chasing different what the steelworkers like to think of as hot shops, metalworking shops around the South and other parts of the country, as well as work with healthcare workers in New England before coming to Chicago and becoming a teacher in Chicago Public Schools at Senn High School, where he was involved in, besides being a union delegate and being a supporter of the earlier reform administration about a decade ago, was also instrumental in the Save Senn campaign. Senn High School was sort of militarized, literally, by the U.S. Navy, which set up shop in the building and took over a big section of that. And it was the debate around the Save Senn issue really, I think, framed a whole discussion about the future of education in Chicago, whose priorities, does it serve, whose agenda is being served by this. Jesse was in the thick of that, and before becoming one of the founding members of the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which is currently the group leading the Chicago Teachers Union. But with that, I'll get out of the way and let Jesse tell the story.
Sisters and brothers, thank you, and thank you for coming. We're going to try to lay out a story here, the three speakers. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the prehistory of sort of the movement, teachers' movement, the educational justice movement in Chicago. I want to talk a little bit about how we conceived of the contract fight and sort of the way we entered that fight broadly. Brandon's going to talk about some of the work that we did both in the neighborhoods but also in the schools, and Becca's going to talk what that was like from a classroom perspective. Therefore, I won't cover all the sort of the pieces. I won't. I think it would take a long time to sort of talk through all that stuff. But I'm going to try to give a picture. Starting, I want to just sort of start by evoking in our memories, it's been a while now, the sea of red that Chicago turned into during those 7 days that we were on strike in early September of last year. People describe, coming downtown for the rallies. We held a daily rally for the first 3 days of the strike. Being on the L or being on the bus, and sort of the L or the bus car turning into a moving demonstration in which literally like people wearing red. If you, as a teacher, walking around with your CTU colors in the city, it was a constant sort of. Buses would pull over and the bus driver would beep the horn and wave their fist for you. The bargaining team, we were back and shuttling to negotiations. You couldn't pay for a cab. Karen Lewis, would get in, and the cabbies would just refuse to take your payment. Etc. I'm not so sure that the folks in the red shirts this weekend with the Blackhawks jerseys are getting the same. Getting the same thing from the cabbies, but at any rate, so in a way that sort of the strike sort of thrust the educational justice fight in Chicago onto the national awareness and into national consciousness. But I want to really begin by making the point that the movement in Chicago that you saw sort of reach its highest expression in August or September of 12 really had a very long set of roots, and I want to begin by giving sort of some credit for that and just saying a few things about the educational justice movement. One of the things is that you have in Chicago a history of teacher union activism. George Schmidt, who's sitting right over there, is editor of Substance newspaper, which is a rank and file newspaper with has been publishing for over 30 years. You're talking about union delegates who held down a union tradition really for a long time. You're talking about people who had fought school closings in their local communities, not on the same scale that we were sort of being active during the strike, but who were able to sort of like mark their opposition to the policies of neoliberal school reform and corporate school reform in a way that was very significant. So it wasn't as if we were building on a new set of ideas. This is really, we're building on a foundation that is at the heart of our success. A lot of that has to do really with sort of the nature of the neoliberal attack on education in Chicago. People hear about Arne Duncan, Race to the Top, and there's a set of policies which really, in which the Obama administration through Duncan were able to get a tremendous number of states to change their educational laws. So you've got charter competition, privately managed, publicly funded schools. You've got all the different high stakes tests and all the consequences of not doing well on the tests in terms of school closings and the rest of it. You've got the demand that states measure student performance back when for evaluating teachers, and that teachers who don't produce high student test results can then be fired despite tenure. So the undermining and elimination of tenure in many cases. These are all sort of Obama education policies that were experimented with or introduced in some form or other in Chicago. And so people say, well, what is it about Chicago? Well, partly what it is about Chicago is that we've seen it for a little long. Duncan was the CEO in Chicago starting in 2002, and so we've had the pleasure of having seen these policies in action for a while longer than the rest of the country. I'm fully confident that when the rest of the people in the country get a good enough taste of them, they're going to want to replicate the other parts of Chicago. One of the things that meant, for example, is that in successive round after round, they closed 75 schools and turned around 25 more. Fired the entire faculty at 25 more. So we had a group of people that opposed school closings that in which they would label schools failures, and those schools would inevitably be poor black schools that were massively under-resourced. We talked about during the strike, there's 160 public schools in Chicago without libraries or librarians. There's 90 schools without, middle schools and elementary schools without playgrounds. Most schools in Chicago have no full-time art and music teacher. In fact, only have a part-time teacher in one or the other of those two areas. Those things have been a fact of life in Chicago for a long time, and that's produced real resistance. That's really in large part why a group of rank and filers, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which I was one of the people who started that very early on in 2008, that's really why we came to office. It was a response to how bad the attack was, and a feeling there wasn't a substantial plan on the union's part or on the part of the people on our side to be able to counter that movement. And our collective decision to try to form an organization and to look at the union in particular as an organization that would be at the heart of the fight back against those policies, I sort of is one of these turning points. I don't have time to get all into sort of the way that internal organization happened. But when we took office, as the new leadership of the CTU on July 1st of 2010, the pace of the attacks were immediate. We had been in office for a day, and they announced that we either had to give up the contractual raise, they were going to freeze our pay and violate our contract, or else they were going to lay off about 2,000 teachers, and then a bunch of extra PSRPs. And so that was and that's all over the front pages. That's the immediate attack. Will the teachers be greedy and hold on to their raise when no one else is getting money, or will they save the students of Chicago and agree to sort of preserve the size of the classes? The second thing that I really want to talk about, and this is sort of, the union really needed to sort of understand on some basic level that we were in for a fight that wasn't just we were in for a fight that was actually structural in nature, in which the people who ran the Board of Education, the people who ran the city, and this is before Mayor Emanuel had been elected. This wasn't just something that we were going to paper over and it was going to go away. We were actually on a collision course with powerful people who had an entire theory of the case about the need to reform public education. That is, corporate education reform, it wasn't a sort of a contingent sort of side idea. This was at the heart of their plan, and it ran right over our back as the union. So we were going to have to be combative. And I think that idea of combativity is often one of the sort of ideas that's lost when people talk about the CTO. People will talk about sort of the way in which the union was able to form an alliance with parents and students. People will talk about how effective we were in messaging. People will talk about sort of some of the mass tactics. But underlying all that was that in the first instance we said we are going to fight for what we believe in, which is universally funded public education that's of high quality for everyone in Chicago, and that means standing up to the mayor, his corporate backers, the privatizers, and the rest of it, and we will do what it takes to have that fight. And we would say, I'm not sure, I cannot promise you in advance that we're going to win that fight, but I can promise you that if we don't have the fight, we're going to lose. And so, the mayor, when Mayor Emanuel was elected, and actually he really began sort of actually messing with us before he even was formally took office. We never seen anything like it exactly. I mean, we kind of knew it was coming on some theoretical level, but this is a guy who was using David Axelrod's old PR firm to hire groups of Black and Latino parents and community members, fill up buses with them, and come down and picket the union behind demands of, we want a longer day, which, by the way, they had spent tens of thousands of dollars polling, and they knew it was a popular demand. School day in Chicago was very short, and they knew that parents who were struggling with multiple part-time jobs and trying to make ends meet wanted their kids in school longer, and they said, we demand a longer day, why won't the teachers union give us a longer day? And that was like an immediate attack, and frankly it took a tremendous, I was having meetings with local union leaders telling us, just give in on that. Give in on that and demand a healthcare freeze and you'll be all right. Like literally people pulling us aside saying, just go for this. You're not going to beat them. And and that's, you might remember, Karen Lewis then had a meeting with Rahm, and sort of famously Karen came out after that meeting and said, he swore at me, and I swore at him back, and that ended the meeting. And everyone was like, oh my God, Karen is telling a tale about meeting with the mayor. But the bottom line is that we had already decided that we were going to fight rather than get run over. And so then the conclusion that you're going to you've got a mayor who swears at you, right? In a private meeting, and that's somehow sacrosanct, and you're not going to tell on him for doing that. It didn't even occur to us. We were going to stick our finger in their eye. So what that meant in very practical terms is we knew obviously that the contract fight was going to be a critical fight, and so we planned for it. And we didn't plan on going on strike. We planned to be ready to go on strike if we had to. And that's the way we talked about it. But rather than just those being words, we did all the things necessary so that if we had to go on strike, we'd win the damn thing. And that meant, it meant starting a couple years out. It meant doing a very conscientious job of talking to our members about what people wanted to see in their contract. We did a lot of meetings. We did maybe 100. We maybe did 100 meetings with various committees out in the schools. We met with delegates. The elected representatives of people's schools are called delegates in Chicago. We did a lot of meetings with those folks. Just constant, literally people's contract. We published these books of contract demands, and then we went through them. We edited them in these huge meetings. It's really, editing that kind of a document that way is a real pain in the butt. I don't recommend it. But it was important because it actually it produced a kind of a collective sense of ownership over what we wanted. And it had been so long since anyone went around to a bunch of teachers in Chicago and said, let's talk about what we want. Let's talk about what our vision is of what our schools should be and make some demands around it. And so, all the forces in society are telling us, lower your expectations, talk about what you're going to give up, start by talking about how much ground you're going to give, and we went the opposite way and talked about how we were going to improve education for folks. We talked about really very early on how we were going to make common cause between the things that we cared about in terms of high quality schools and the things the public cared about. And that's the final point that I'll make, which is that for the CTU, the question of a contract was always one and the same as the question of educational justice. It always had to do with what kind of schools do students deserve? What kind of schools would we want to work in? And so when we were at the stage of sort of planning, where we were trying to think about what are the things that we're willing to fight about, there were some hard conversations about what are the kinds of things that students and parents want? And how are we going to have a mechanism where we can add those demands to the set of things that we're demanding? And you don't do that, but you can't keep two sets of books. You can't say, teachers, hey, this is all about your raise, and then tell the parents that this is all about high quality education for their kids. You have to have a conversation with your members about the education, demands and student demands, and you have to have a conversation with parents about why what's good for their. You have to do both those things and convince everyone in your movement that defending each other's interests is the way to produce solidarity and better outcome for everybody, and that's really what we did. It meant, for example, taking on some fights that we were kind of sure losers. There was, for example, a move to close a bunch of schools in the winter of 11 going into 12. And we knew they were going to close the schools. They always close the schools. There's no democracy in the Chicago Board of Education. But we took that fight on anyway because we wanted to do two things. We wanted to sort of show that you could form an alliance between parents and teachers on an anti-racist basis, and saying these is a racist policy and we're against it. And by having a fight about that, you demonstrate that the union was willing to put its money where its mouth was, and you could form an alliance there. And I guess that's just one point. I'll leave it at that. So at any rate, so where that gets us then is that when we come into the actual the strike itself, and there's a lot of things that are happening at the bargaining table. There's a lot of things that are happening in terms of the way the press, all the legal questions that are around the strike and whatnot. But in a sense, the strike itself was the sort of culmination of a series of processes that we were involved in a very self-conscious way for a couple of years. So the developing of sort of organization out in our schools. We had talked about we want to have 10% of the membership of this union actively involved in committees. Our ability to talk about a set of issues as educational issues that had, so we talked about fair compensation, but we also talked about smaller classes, or defending class size. We talked about job security for teachers, but we also talked about a better day. Which was partly a counter to the longer day, but was also partly a way to encapsulate a whole series of concerns about educational issues. The amount of pressure on the union leadership is in a strike situation is overwhelming. You've got 400,000 students out of school. You've got, it's the headline news story on every single news station. It's the front of every newspaper. It's the middle of every newspaper. It's continual. It's 24/7. It's the pressure of an entire city on you. Your staff can't handle the situation. There's a union communication department of 4, and there's 700 media outlets trying to cover the thing. There's actually no way you can just you can't do that. I don't know how people have in the past. I don't know how you do that without the entire sort of preparation work and lining up of all the forces of the union, community groups, people out in the schools behind sort of a vision of what it is you're fighting for. And that sort of then, and so really once the strike happened and we were trying to sort out where a settlement was at the negotiating table, you know, the mechanism of the strike was really carried on both by, you know, frankly, a lot of incredibly hard work on the union staff, but really really critically by a lot of hard work on the part of all the people out in the schools, all the supporters, et cetera. And that sort of, that produced the, really ultimately the ability to keep that together organizationally, et cetera. That produced our ability to, you know, say we think we have something, you know, we think we have a framework for an agreement, and, you know, membership says, oh, actually we want to read it, stay out on strike. You know, and, you know, the mainstream press was going crazy. I mean, like, you know, like the red baiting starts immediately. Like, you know, there's a woman named Sue Garza who has like her car all taped up with signs, and it's, you know, strike. Everyone calls it the strike mobile, right? And, you know, they get a picture of me and Karen looking really tired, and they put it on one side, a full page photo on one side, and they get a picture of Sue Garza looking like a crazy anarchist, you know, with a tattoo across her wrist, and like, you know, facing us on the other side. So like she's there in her crazy stroke mobile looking like a maniac, and there's us, you know. And the reality is that Sue Garza's a member of the caucus and a key leader and someone who we've spent, you know, hundreds of hours working. There's no like us and Sue Garza like actually are on the same side. But you know, but immediately there was that pressure and the attempt to sort of to say, oh my goodness, you know, the union's out of control. This is a bunch of people who are going to keep our schools shut down. You know, how dare they? But, you know, the bottom line was that what the organizational strength of it had to do with its roots. And so I know that isn't like that's not an easy or facile story, but ultimately what this is really about, it's about a lot of hard work, a lot of preparation, and the understanding that there's a political opening, and there's a real depth of sentiment there that has to do with the fight for educational justice. And so we're all going to carry that work on. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. If you were in Chicago during the strike and you came along to one of the rallies, chances are you did some chanting, and chances are that was led by Brandon Johnson, who was the first person on the mic, the lead chanter, agitator, and organizer in a whole number of different venues, somehow managing to be in several parts of town simultaneously. For those of us who try to keep up. Brandon is a longtime activist. He got involved with children actually as a program director for the New City YMCA, which was located across the street from the Cabrini Green housing development on the near north side of Chicago. And Cabrini Green has really been in the front lines of the gentrification push as the real estate developers who run the city have been pushing African Americans out of that neighborhood for the past a number of decades. In fact, they're not quite done, since we just had a fight for another school closure at Menier, where fortunately they thought the better of tangling with people like Charisse, who's on the panel tonight, and you'll see why when you hear her. Brandon served for as a number of years working with the kids at New City Y, decided he wanted to stay with the kids, so went and got his education qualifications and came back to teach in the neighborhood at Jenner Academy, and witnessed firsthand this process of displacement and gentrification that was taking place not just among the student population in Chicago, which is 88% students of color, but among the teaching force. In Chicago, we had, in the early 1990s, about some people say as many as half, about 46% of the teaching force was African American. Today that's about 26%. That's not an accident, it's a policy. It has to do with the fact that schools that are targeted for closure are heavily, overwhelmingly in African American, Latino neighborhoods, and African American teachers have been most disproportionately displaced by this action. So Brandon, as a CTU member, first at Jenner and then later at Westinghouse High School, was instrumental in the relaunching the CTU Black Caucus. I'm sure I'll say a bit more about it. The African-American struggle in the Chicago Teachers Union was very important, I think, in shaping the character of the union, unlike some other teachers' unions, particularly in New York, where the black struggle against school segregation and overcrowding in the 60s, which led to mass boycotts, also energized African-American educators who went into, who demanded the right to become full-time teachers. They were separated into being substitutes, hence the name Substance of the newspaper that George founded, and is still with us today and playing an indispensable role. So Brandon helped reformulate the CTU Black Caucus, and the CTU officers, recognizing what a valuable agitator he was, hired him. I'll let him tell the rest.
Thank you. So that introduction makes me sound so intense and serious. Let me just say that the security here is incredible. I walked in without a pass, and they sent a gentleman after me to make sure I was legit, and thank God we don't have a stand your ground policy here. I was able to work my way out of that. Yeah, tough crowd. So it's a special day because I'm also celebrating my wedding anniversary today, and what better way to celebrate an anniversary with a bunch of leftists, right? It's a big deal. 15 years. Every 3 years, my wife renews my contract, and so she just informed me though that she is going to sign me to a long-term deal, and for the next 4 to 5 years. With some incentives, I'll be able to hang around a little bit longer. Apparently, the way I move and how agile I am at this age of my life, she just said she couldn't pass up the opportunity to sign someone of my caliber. So I'm saying all this because this is being videotaped, and I know my sons are going to see this one day, and they're going to say, why were you at a socialist conference at your anniversary? And I just want to get the record out there that I love my wife dearly, and so much so that we rented a room here at Crown Plaza to spend the rest of our anniversary for the next 2 days here. So I was sitting down thinking, I had, one of my worst nightmares having to come up behind Jesse Sharkey. And so I formulated all of those jokes just beforehand to get folks to rethink this conversation a little bit and not have to be under so much pressure to come and have to articulate myself after him. So we have an incredible challenge, of course. Sharkey talked about the 2 years before the strike. Somehow I got drafted into that experience. Actually, it was minding my business, teaching at Westinghouse. To be quite frank with you, having spent a good portion of my experience in Chicago and Cabrini Green, when you're working with a population that is underserviced, it can be very stressful. And quite frankly, I would come home each day, and it wouldn't be until I would re-describe what happened in the classroom that I realized, how challenging our experiences can be as educators. And my wife would just look at me funny because I would say, look, it wasn't that bad of a day. The window wasn't all the way open. We got them back up. Everything was fine, and somehow we managed to get back to our lesson. But it was that experience that actually motivated me to take a more serious role, not just within the teaching community, but the community at large. And what I wanted to do, though, is get the opportunity to see what education looked like across the city. And so I got the opportunity to teach at the high school level, selective enrollment, felt guilty every day, right, because that's also part of the stratification of education in this city. But having taught at a school where the needs were vast, and then going into a school where kids seemingly took their education a little bit more seriously, taught me an awful lot about the dichotomy that exists within the public school system here in Chicago. And it was that experience at Westinghouse that led me to believe that, one, I need to make a real hard commitment to what a real educational justice fight could look like in this city, and more importantly, any chances of me being a principal went out the window with those both experiences. And so I've been set free, and there is no threat of me becoming part of the corporate structure as of yet. And if I do, know that I got a hefty price for it. So if I do sell you out, just know, hey, right. I just tell people that right off, look, my baby got to get to college. I'm just saying. So a couple of summers ago, the union decided to really to just put some boots on the ground, to start knocking on doors of our members' home, to start to have a conversation about what a fair contract would look like. And again, the expectation was to knock on some doors this summer, get a sense of, a couple of summers ago, and get a sense of where our members are, and then return back to Westinghouse to figure out, how to be a better activist even within my school. And that experience over the summer changed my life. It's something that I don't think we appreciate in this era, door-to-door contact with individuals, seeing how CTU members lived, to see members come to their doors in homes just like mine, either a two-flat or a single-family home. No one's getting rich off of this profession. There was a couple of people that had some real nice homes, so I do question what their spouses do. But generally speaking, folks lived regular, middle-class lifestyles in Chicago. The vast majority, of course, of our members lived right within striking distance of the schools they taught in. And I'll never forget, there was a woman that came to the door. She had been teaching for over 30 years, and she was obviously suspicious of me coming. The union had never knocked on members' doors. And when the woman came to the door, she, clearly, in her defense, she did the right thing. 6 foot, 250 pounds. You just need to be careful when you see that come to your door. And she wouldn't open the door, but as the conversation began to move forward, I saw a look in her eye that changed me. And the look was of such despair that after 30 years of my life in this profession, I'm not confident that I will have 3 or 4 more years to finish this career. That our membership had been so demoralized and so beaten down that the idea of this profession being something that you can retire in was something that folks didn't see if that was possible. And for someone who now has approximately 23 more years before I can retire, I'm getting there. I can see Florida from here, I swear. I knew that if this profession is going to be viable again, and this woman looked me in the face and she said, listen, I fought, before you knew your name. And if we're going to protect this institution and protect these children, we're counting on people like you. And it was in that moment, in that hot July, that it changed the direction of even my focus. Because she was right. There were people fighting for educational justice before many of us even knew we would be activists one day. And so the demoralization, the working conditions, Jesse laid that out. We're talking schools that did not have playgrounds, cafeterias, no gymnasium, no air conditioning. We didn't have proper ventilation. Sharkey spoke of the couple of school closing fights ago. And there was a particular school on the west side of Chicago that literally those students had been starved out of their school. There was no ventilation in that building. They had no art, no music. The computer lab was put together by one of our members where he patched together a few computers just so kids can have access to the internet. We're talking about a 21st so-called century city where kids do not have access to the internet. And so these experiences, of course, ultimately provided the impetus behind the level of urgency. And so this was the harsh reality, that a fair contract, we couldn't have a conversation about a fair contract without dealing with the demoralization and the broken spirit of members who dedicate their lives every single day to poor people. And so it was my responsibility to provide a little bit of hope. And quite frankly, I didn't know how to do that. But what I did remember was that growing up in a household, where my father was a public sector worker, a union job, and he didn't come home bleeding union every day, but I did know that my father had a little bit of job security, and my 10 brothers and sisters can go see a doctor for $5 and I can get my inhaler. I knew that having a union meant that I could breathe. And so if nothing else, we knew that this fight had to be a fight not just about how do we improve public education, but how do we make sure that the working class families in this city and in cities across America actually have a little bit of dignity again. And so here's where some of the goals. We had to restore that hope. We had to get our members back in the mindset that, listen, if anything is going to change, It ain't coming from the east or the west. It's coming right out of our living rooms. It's coming right out of our classrooms. It's coming right out of our neighborhoods. And if we don't get involved, there's not a lot of hope for us. And so convincing our members to wear a red T-shirt on Friday was a task. It took us a year to convince CTU members that it's okay to associate yourself with labor. And so some wouldn't wear the red T-shirts, and so these were the baby socialists would just wear the buttons, right? We got to start them off, gently. And so eventually they started putting on red T-shirts. And so building that sense of consciousness. Another one of our goals, not just to bring the hope and show this hope and solidarity through a union, was to also bring some dignity back to teaching, where teachers didn't feel like they could perfect their craft because of the overemphasis of testing and grading and all the other tasks that come with teaching, which we certainly recognize there is some value, but the overemphasis of that has caused the life of education and the desire to love and teach to be eradicated. And so we had to bring some dignity and restore some hope and some joy into teaching. Our members had to be reminded, remember once upon a time when teaching was fun, when learning was fun. And listen, if we were to be honest, and we thank God for the brothers and sisters in Washington who helped raise some consciousness across this country that the overemphasis of testing is degrading to our students and it offers no pedagogical benefit. And it was a moment where that movement, don't want to get too far off, but there's a really cute story about my son, because sometimes we fall victim to these corporate approaches. And so I asked my son, I said, Owen, you're going into kindergarten. You can't live at home forever. Have you thought about what you might want to do for a living? And so, hey, I'm raising a black boy in Chicago. You got to start young. And so my son looked me in the face. He says, Dad, I've narrowed it down to two things. I either want to be a pilot or Spider-Man. And of course, I'm rooting for Spider-Man, because what father would not want their son to web people for a living? And it was that moment where I realized that while we're pushing our teachers to make sure that our students are college and career ready and all these tests to make sure our 5-year-olds are ready for life, my son wants to be Spider-Man. And so it helped me rethink in those conversations we've had all over the city to talk about it's okay to have fun in our classroom. And our members begin to buy in to this idea of a contract fight coupled with this ideal of restoring hope in teaching again. And so we built that, and we worked all summer. And as Jesse mentioned, there was this struggle where the mayor came out right after us and pushed this longer day, and we had to convince our members not just to wear red and to show some solidarity, but to not to buy into this longer school day push prematurely. Because the goal was, of course, to get many schools to buy into this longer school day before a contract could be settled, and then that would be the motivation by which the Board of Education would undermine, of course, our compensation. And so we began to do that. There was one other component to this fight that I think was very critical, is that we began to engage the community. As I said before, we knocked on the doors of our members, but there has to be a conscious decision to speak to the very people that actually help us with our livelihood. We have to have a real, honest conversation about poverty and racism. And as Lee mentioned, one of the things that changed I guess my course a little bit too, because the woman that looked me in the eye, you can see how defeated she was. It was an African-American veteran teacher, which is, typifies what the stereotypical view of an inner city teacher is. And as I began to go around, another assignment that we had, I know I'm moving through quickly, but after we had the door knocking campaign, we had to have these school meetings. And I would go into these schools where folks felt very defeated, but we also saw like this huge elephant in the room, that I didn't see any black people. in these buildings. Schools where 99% of the student population are black children, you didn't see black teachers. And we began to do some investigation around that. And the union was very embracing of the idea of making sure that we're having a conversation that when we're closing schools and when we're undermining public sector, that's also an attack on black labor. And it's well past due that we have a black labor movement in this city and in this country so that we can restore a little bit of hope back into the ideal of middle class for folks who have been marginal since the inception of this country. And so we begin to have those conversations that, listen, when we're talking about this contract fight, we have to be willing to embrace not just this labor struggle, right, but this struggle for civil and human rights as well. And so, of course, that was some motivation behind the rebirth of the Black Caucus. And one of the things that I found very interesting when I would go in these buildings and we would convince our members to get back involved in the union that had been unresponsive, admittedly, for a long time, we started to have conversations with these black educators, and it turns out that many of our black educators on purpose would go teach in schools that were under-resourced and that were likely to be disinvested in and closed. And many of these members had more degrees than the very people making the policies to close these schools and undermine the system. And so as we begin to organize it, that conversation of race spilled into our community engagement. Listen, we would not have gotten the type of contract that we did get had it not been for our conscious decision to engage the community. We have a community board that the CTU was a part of that we did not control. Let me be clear. One of the things that labor has to do a better job of is actually relinquishing some control back over to the community. There is no CTA if black people ain't riding the buses. There's no CPS if black children aren't going into these schools. And so as we begin to have these conversations and build this consciousness within our rank and file members, within the communities, and being very strategic about our conversations about race and poverty, when we decided to go on strike, the third day of the strike, we made a conscious decision to build on that community collectiveness. And so we took our rally from downtown, and I will pat myself on the back briefly, that in those strategy meetings, I'm thinking to myself, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a rally in the neighborhoods where the media can actually see where our members teach? And so that third day of the strike, a rally moved into the neighborhoods on the west and south side of Chicago. And what a sight to see during the strike, where you had hundreds and thousands of red t-shirts marching down Kedzie, Cottage Grove, bringing the message of social justice, civil rights, of course, and labor rights right in front of them. And there's a woman here today, Latrice Jameson, who actually spoke at that rally. And we called her, I think the day before, I called one of our rank and file Black Caucus members, and I said, find me a black parent. Shouldn't have a problem doing that. And Latrice showed up, and she's at a socialist conference today. See, I take some credit for recruiting. So whatever the commission is, I want that. Hey, Latrice. And so where do we go? And so we made these conscious decisions to not only knock on doors, to build powers within the union, within our schools, and Becca will talk more candidly about that, but this community push, not being afraid to talk about poverty, and use the word black. I know people like to use the word African American. That's a very soft, gentle response, but there's a blackness that exists not just in Chicago, but across this world that we have to be more cognizant of, and so we did that. And so we were able to build some power. Where do we go from here? We have to continue to build some community consciousness. Listen, you all, during the strike, the mayor was hoping that the community would turn against us, but because of our community work 2 years prior, I want to say nearly 70% of people supported the strike, CPS parents, but that number was even higher within the black and brown community, where like 80-something% of black parents says, not only are we trusting teachers, but you stay out on strike as long as necessary because we trust your judgment. And so the work that we've built had a lot to do with the conscious decision of this union to not to be afraid to have a conversation about poverty and race and get in our communities and get inside of our classrooms so that we can actually build some power. Thank you. Becca?
Thanks, Brandon. As Brandon said, I mean, this has had to have been the most popular big city teacher strike ever in U.S. history. I can't think of anything like it. I'm sure there's been popular local, small district strikes, but in terms of the kind of social impact that a teacher strike has on a city, and yet still have overwhelming community support, despite Rahm Emanuel's political connections, despite the press and so forth, was really remarkable. I took my son, who's a student at CPS, to picket lines every day, different places around the city, saw universal support, except for one place where there was a different reception. And I'll let Becca tell that story. Becca Bohr was a member of the Boston Teachers Union, where owing to the process of laying off teachers, churn and burn the young teachers, was cast out of Boston, but it was Chicago's gain. She's a teacher of social studies at Kenwood Academy on the South Side, and an active member of CORE as a rank and filer. I'll let Becca tell the story of the one unwelcome picket line that I think existed at during the Chicago Teachers Union strike.
All right, so it definitely was an incredible year. Ups and downs, but a lot of ups at the beginning of the year. And I think I want to make four small points and just tell the stories of the actual strike and what it felt like from the perspective of being in a classroom and being in a building and trying to organize a building that wasn't very organized when I got there. So I've been teaching at my school for 3 years, and one of the key things coming into my building is we had a pretty scared faculty, a faculty that was getting whiter and whiter. As Brandon said, there is a reality of laying off of older black teachers and hiring of a lot of people that look like me, relatively young white teachers, not from Chicago, not from the neighborhood, don't know very much about the realities of our students in terms of sort of what we look like and where we're from. And there previously, or while my first year there, our union delegate was fired. And there was basically a silence over the organizing within my school. And so going from there to 99% of our faculty voting yes for the authorization of the strike, to 99% of our faculty coming out on the picket line and organizing and having a much better sort of democratic nature within the school, and all of that happening in 2 years is kind of mind-blowing. And so I want to sort of take us through sort of what that looked like. So the 3 points I want to talk about is, one, we knew in our school, and I think this is generalizable for the rest of Chicago, we knew exactly what we were fighting for, and it wasn't like it was a mystery to teachers why we were out there, and we talked a lot about it. Secondly, consciousness changes really, really quickly, and I know that I've known that for a long time, and I've read a lot of books about how that happens, and I've read newspaper articles about how it happened somewhere else, but actually being part of that process was unbelievable in a lot of ways. Third, democracy in a union is necessary, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, though we won the strike, austerity continues, and it's been rough. And I'll sort of touch on that briefly at the end. So knowing what we were fighting for. I mean, I think one of the important things, obviously, it was spoken about, but the document that came out that the CTU put forward, the schools Chicago students deserve, really spelled out not only what we're against, but what we're fighting for. And we know what our schools are like. We know how much money we spend on resources for our kids. We know when we don't have access to photocopy machines. We know when we run out of paper. We know when the AC doesn't work or there is no AC. We know when there's a no tolerance policy on our students that helps foster the school to prison pipeline. We know the realities of our school. And so I felt like through talking about all of those realities and having the union back us up in terms of saying, wait a minute, we're not for these things. We're for something, a completely different vision of public education. A lot of teachers really got on board and said, yes, these are the types of things that we want to fight for. But we're also for fair compensation. We're also pissed off that our raises got taken away from us the year before. We're also furious that they want to get rid of our health care. We're also furious about this idea about merit pay and what you want to take away step and lane changes where you get paid more for more education or for more years of experience. And so there's a lot of anger in the schools around what we understood of Rahm, of what Rahm was saying in terms of trying to gut our contract fully. And so both of those things happened at the same time. And so there was a ton of organizing. Now, when we're talking about the wearing of the red t-shirt, in my school, nobody wore red. And it says, we have a little union calendar books, and it says, like, wear red on Friday. And I remember, like, looking through and being like, oh, no one's wearing red. I'm not going to wear red. I don't have tenure. I'm not wearing red. And we actually, there's a crew of us who would call each other the night before or text each other and say, are you going to wear red tomorrow? Okay, I'm going to wear my Boston Red Sox shirt because it's red, but at least it doesn't say the Chicago Teachers Union, and I can at least say if my principal asks anything that I'm wearing, oh, it's just my Red Sox shirt. I don't know what you're talking about. But there was a crew of us who were trying, whatever, I'm from Boston. So at least it was, trying to figure out, well, how do we begin to make a little bit of motion in a school where a delegate was just fired? And we began to think about those things. Then there were, of course, the events outside of the school, and that's extremely important with the CTU and what CORE organized in terms of events that were targeting TIF funds, so targeting, for example, the Hyatt, where Penny Pritzker, who was on the Board of Education, where she got tax breaks and owns the Hyatt, and so targeting of that, saying this is money for schools, shouldn't be funneled into billionaires' pockets, and people were talking about, wait a minute, what are the different types of policies and structures that starve our schools and starve our children? And so this was something that was talked about over lunch. These were the types of demands. Everyone read the pamphlet that the CTU put out, Chicago's the schools Chicago students deserve, and we were all constantly talking about it. And not only talking about what we're for, but the end talked about what are concrete demands. So TIF reform, a concrete demand that we could talk about. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of creativity about the types of activism that we could actually do. So they were building, my school's in Hyde Park, and they're building a Hyatt, right, like 3 blocks from my school. And so that was actually a target of multiple different protests and actions that people at my school and other folks in Hyde Park organized in order to say, wait a minute, here's a concrete target that we can actually put forward. There was also a bunch of other demands at the end, end the wars. We need to actually fight for more funding for education, full stop, rather than funding prisons and wars and things like that. So I think that's really important. But it wasn't just the politics that we knew, which is obviously very important, but there's also organizational training, and that cannot be underemphasized. The CTU organized a delegates training the March before we went on strike. And that delegates training was open for delegates, but also for anyone who was organizing in school. And I went on a campaign to get 5 people, 6 people in my school out to that so that we could brainstorm together. Well, what do we do? We don't really have a delegate yet, or we're just forgetting a delegate because nobody wants to stick their neck out because the last one was fired. How do we organize? How do we begin to get a group of people actually wearing red? What is the nature of, can we organize with other people in the neighborhood? And it front-loaded a lot of, obviously, the politics and understanding what the neoliberal attack was at that meeting, but there was also a breakout session where all of the different schools who were in the same neighborhood were in the same room. And so then we got to meet all of the delegates at all of the different schools around where we were. And that was really important because then we started, having emails, and we would go to the bar on Friday and start meeting each other and talking to each other and feeling like, wait a minute, we're not by ourselves isolated in this school with our own problems, but actually can talk to each other. So I think as much cross-school pollination, so to speak, in terms of organizing is extremely, extremely important. And then the other thing, and this was already mentioned by the previous speakers, but how important calling out the problem as it is, because for so long the teachers have just been bashed and bashed and bashed that no one had dignity. I mean, Brandon is right, like there was no sense that teachers, this was a dignified profession whatsoever, no sense that we or our students deserved more in inner city education. And Karen Lewis called it out as it was, and she said, we have to talk about poverty. Poverty, poverty, poverty. We have to talk about poverty. We know when our kids are hungry. We know when we feed them. We know when kids can't pay attention because of the realities of structural and institutional poverty and racism in our society. And I think it was Jesse Jackson who first said, or called out, apartheid education in Chicago, and that was something we ran with, or maybe we said it first and then he repeated it. I don't really care. Okay, it was the other way around. Sorry. It only got to the Tribune when he said it. But anyway, in terms of talking about the way in which we see structural racism, obviously, in our city. So that's one thing. So we knew our politics, and that was something that a lot of people, I think, in the media were really surprised by when we went out to those big demonstrations, seas of red, why are you down here? And it was like every single teacher, parent, community member, student was like, well, I'm down here because I'm fighting for public education, because public education is disappearing, and we know that this attack is not just about this school, but it's about all schools. Literally, every single person knew exactly why they were out there, and that is one of the foundations to being able to win a strike, knowing why you're out there. Secondly, how quickly consciousness changes. So no one wore red for a very long time. We started slowly wearing red, getting more and more confidence. It helped that our principal left. But then there was, sort of a what do we do now, trying to build in my school. And so there were organizers of about maybe 5 or 6 of us who went out to this March organizing meeting, but then continued to organize in our school, call each other, making sure that we went out to the different events, trying to make sure that we were sort of part of knitting together something. And then I remember seeing on the core listserv, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, that there had been all these mock votes, and then it hit, alternative media that there were these mock votes around seeing for a strike authorization, because we needed to get over 75% of all members to actually authorize the vote. So my delegate called me up and said, oh, let's do this, it's a great idea. So we decided to do it, and just said, okay, we're gonna do a mock vote tomorrow, and I had really low expectations, I'll be honest. I was nervous. We have departments don't talk to each other necessarily at my school, and we had so many people come down to vote yes for this mock strike vote authorization, including the entire cafeteria staff came down and said, we know we're not CTU, but we would like to authorize your strike. So we counted them. But I think a really important turning point was there was a march in May, and this was the sort of first time you saw the sea of red downtown, where there was 9,000 people probably, 4,000 inside of the Congress Auditorium, downtown Chicago, spillover crowd outside, a sea of red going through the streets in the march afterwards. And my coworker turned to me and he said, we're not by ourselves. We're not alone, and we have a chance. And that was the first time, I think, that really across the city, people believed that we had a chance to possibly win. I think a lot of us said, oh, we're probably going to go out by then, but this was the first point where people felt really really hopeful. And I remember walking downtown and seeing baristas and people in bakeries, the workers, and their, thumbs up coming out in their aprons, people writing "Go Teachers" on a piece of paper, office workers, and sticking it in the window. And we just sort of, the whole downtown Chicago was pro-teacher on that moment. And it was incredible. And I really feel like for the first time, we began to hold our heads high, really, and saw that. So then, we went out, and it was crazy. We, did all the phone calls and lists, making sure everyone came out. And one of the things that on my picket line that was really interesting is we're in the Hyde Park Kenwood neighborhood, and so we're really close to Obama. And so one of the first days of the strike, so we were organizing picket line. We didn't know exactly what to do. At one point, I said, "Do we really have?" Someone else said, "Do we really have to march around for this long?" None of us had ever been on strike before. None of us really knew what we were doing. We weren't really blocking anyone from coming into the building. So people were like, "Oh, maybe we can just play music," or so we had blasting from the back of a car, "Fight the Power," and a bunch of our teachers many of whom veteran black teachers marching and singing to fight the power, parents coming by saying, don't you go back until you get what's yours, that kind of excitement. And so we went off on a march after, we picketed for a while. We're like, let's go for a march. So we can march around Hyde Park, and someone says, let's go to Obama's house, let's do it. So we start marching off to Obama's house, we're chanting, we get maybe like a block and a half away, and you could see people start marching a little bit slower, a little bit more tentatively, and then all of a sudden we our march sort of veers off, goes down another side street, and we don't quite get to Obama's house. And there's a big discussion, are we being too confrontational? Obama's really on our side. He hasn't said anything about the strike yet, so we don't know what he's thinking, all those types of debates. And so we had this out and, went back to school and, chanted a little bit more, came back the next day. The next day we rally outside of David Vitale's house, who's on the Board of Education, where we take over the street, we're screaming, yelling. There's nobody there. There's like a housekeeper comes out, and it's like, what is going on? Literally, no one there. And then one of my coworkers starts screaming, Obama's house, Obama's house. And so we're like, okay. And so we go marching up to Obama's house, and we stop in front of, and we get there, stop in front. We start chanting, hey, Obama, take a stand, give us what we demand. And we're chanting that, and the Secret Service are like, whoa, what's going on? And we sort of stop for a minute, and then the Secret Service is like, go, 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 go. My Palestinian coworker runs over to give him a high five, and they're like, no, don't come over here. What's going on? Are you a terrorist? And then we sort of march along. But it was one of those moments where I think you could see how people were becoming more and more emboldened, and particularly our support increased over the course of the week. And we felt that with our parents and with our students and with ourselves. And so that was sort of one of those instances where people were holding up their heads a little bit higher and feeling a little bit more proud. Can I tell one more story? Do I have time? Okay, one quick more story. The story of democracy in our unions, because I think this is really important. So at the end of the first week of the strike, as Jesse mentioned, here's what the contract's going to look like at the House of Delegates meeting, which is the meeting of our delegates. And the delegates said, okay, we'll take it back to our members and we'll decide. And it's like, okay. So we voted on, or the delegates, I'm not a delegate, but the delegates voted to have 2 more days to read over the contract and decide what's going to happen. So my coworker and I were at that meeting. We took the tentative contract, went to Kinko's, made photocopies of it, brought it the next day. The first hour, we're all drinking our coffee on the picket line. We stopped picketing by this point because no one's crossing. So we're sitting on the concrete next to our school. We're annotating, we're reading everything, we're writing in the margins, we're very teacher-like, circling the words we don't know, and all of that. And we do that for about 2 hours, and then we all make our way to the park. And there's a park, and there's bleachers. We all sit on the bleachers, and we go through reading out loud and discussing every single article of the contract. And we went through and we talked about, do we think this is good enough? No. And what's so amazing about that is not just that we were, debating whether or not we were going to accept the contract, but that we had, not just at my school, but across the city, we had school members for the first time reading their contracts, for the first time knowing what their rights are, and then for the first time beginning to say, wait a minute, how do we enforce this? And that's really important, because we had a 2.5-hour discussion. After reading our contract, we took a straw poll. We came back the next day. We had 2 more hours of discussion, and then we, as a body, voted for our delegate to go in and to decide to suspend the strike, and that we would accept this contract. But what was really important is, out of that meeting, is we set up our Professional Problems Committee, which is a committee that enforces the contract and meets with the principal in order to make sure that that happens. This is a committee that had been completely defunct at my school. Nobody wanted to stick their head out. But now every single member knew what our rights were, or at least had more familiarity with the contract, because we had gone through and we had read it all. And I have to say that to this day, we still have a functioning professional problems committee at PPC, and we're trying to begin to organize and actually know what our rights are, which I think is a step forward in a serious way. So although there have been a myriad of attacks since the end of the strike, we had our victory, but there's been school closings, there were 10 layoffs at my schools, there's budget cuts right now, but you have a stronger union now than you did a year ago, and you have more community activists and parents who are unequivocally in some ways on our side than we did a year ago, and that's really hopeful.